Let's now get some reaction and analysis from UK-based journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark. Neil, thanks for being with us today live from the UK. Now, the Arab League's postponed an emergency meeting on Syria, but didn't actually say why. What's the pan-Arab body possibly waiting for? I mean, isn't time of the essence for the people of Syria?
Well, I think it's been a very bad week for the empire. It's been a very bad week for the US and its allies because this isn't going to plan. The rebels have been routed this past week, and by this time, I think Hillary Clinton and the Saudis and the Qataris were all hoping that they'd have a nice pro-Western government installed in Damascus. It hasn't gone to plan. The reason it hasn't gone to plan is the Syrian people themselves. The majority of the Syrian people support the government. And if that wasn't the case, then the government would have fallen a long time ago. So to answer your question, I think the Arab League are undecided now what to do. They're in a real pickle, as is Hillary Clinton, as are the Turks. Because the Syrian people have fought back.
All right, now what about Kofi Annan? I mean, he was praised somewhat for his efforts to mediate peace, but ultimately, I mean, he failed to break the deadlock, and now he's stepping down. Do you think his successor possibly could succeed, given all the circumstances?
I don't think it really matters, Karen, who succeeds Kofi Annan, unless there is a sort of sea shift in the approach from the West and the Arab League, because at the moment, all they're talking about incessantly is Assad must go. The reality is that probably the majority of people in Syria support President Assad and the government. And that's abundantly clear now. And unless they drop that and actually support the Russian and Chinese position or move closer to the Russian and Chinese position, then there won't be any difference. We've already got the framework for democratic change in Syria. We had a new constitution supported by 89% of Syrian people. Why don't the West go along with that? Well, we know why they don't want that, because they just want Assad out.
Now, Russia wants the UN mission to Syria to keep running, but the U.S. gave a somewhat lukewarm reaction to the idea. What do you think the logic is behind Washington's reasoning here?
We've got to understand quite clearly the US doesn't want a peaceful solution to the situation in Syria. The very last thing they want is democratic elections, free democratic elections, because they know the Ba'ath Party would do very well. And so they want to undermine the UN mission. They did it all the time under Kofi Annan. Instead of pressurizing the rebels to put down their arms, they actually encourage them, actually sending them arms. So it's quite clear that Washington doesn't want a peaceful solution. They want violent regime change. So unless that changes, then I'm afraid the bloodshed will continue.
Now, stepping up support for the rebels while piling on more pressure on Assad with Washington and its allies, these actions certainly bypass the UN. So how much leverage does the world body actually have in the Syrian crisis?
Well, it's being bypassed. I mean, it's pretty clear now that Washington's tried everything to try to bully and cajole Russia and China into going on board, but Russia and China, thankfully, are having none of it. And so now the UN is saying, well, the US is now saying if we can't get this through the UN, we'll do it ourselves. And we had the grotesque meeting yesterday in Turkey between Hillary Clinton and the Turkish leaders, which was illegal. They're talking about regime change in a country which is illegal by international law. And so this is grossly illegal. We're talking about criminality on a massive scale here. And it just shows to everybody that the US doesn't care about international law.
Neil, RT's been showing a gruesome amateur video, and it apparently shows rebels throwing the bodies of post office workers from a rooftop in Aleppo. It's not exactly a pleasant PR for the opposition. How much support do you really think that they have among Syrians at this point?
Well, nowhere near as much as we're led to believe in the West. I mean, the dominant Western narrative, Karen, over the last 15 months has been that President Assad has no support and the rebels have all the support. It's the opposite way around, really, because the majority of support is with the government. The rebels have been committing appalling atrocities that are turning off ordinary people. So we had people who supported Assad at the beginning, and we had a lot of people not sure which way to go. But they're actually being turned off by these appalling atrocities that you've outlined. And I would say probably the support for President Assad is stronger now than it was back in March 2011.
All right. And very briefly, with the mandate of the UN observer mission to end next week, how is the team's departure from the country expected to affect that situation over there?
Well, I mean, it was there. I mean, the Russians and Chinese wanted to stay there. I think that there is going to be a grave danger that the rebels become even more violent now, more desperate. Because it's quite clear they haven't got majority support, and they will be using more and more violence with attacks on members of the government, etc. So I think we're in a very, very worrying position. But this bloodshed can only end with the US changing its policy. The US is the main player. The blood is on Hillary Clinton's hands and the UK's hands, William Hague's hands too. And unless we get a change from these people, bloodshed will continue, I'm afraid.
All right. Reaction and analysis live from Oxford. Journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark, thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Karen.